Hello, everybody. This is a fictional piece about the COVID-19 pandemic, part of a larger piece, a mix of poetry and fiction. And this segment is called The Shockwaves and Their Impact on a Millennial Psyche. The curator begins his curation of the Dylan Starr Memoirs Exhibit at the museum. Yes, I like longer titles sometimes. And so we begin. And this is from the curator. Our views of a person can evolve so drastically and in the midst of extremely disorienting periods of one's life. So these evolutions can be felt perhaps with quite exceptional meaningfulness, like a desert oasis, like a single rich and lively island in a vast expanse of sea. Or better yet, like an archipelago. Or better yet still, like the earth. This mystical universe has no other likeness of. No other known planets to support life as we know it. What I mean is that some evolutions can be dramatic makeovers of souls, revolutions in people's notions of the universe, multiverse. To experience certain episodes in human history and in natural history that are very much unlike almost any other. And of course, as time somewhat mystically proceeds, the context is often shaken up, sometimes more violently, as in the form, let us say, of a war, tsunami, earthquake, hurricane, blizzard, tornado, pandemic, etc. And perhaps at other times it was just unseasonably cold or warm for a day or a series of days. Perhaps one kiss changed everything one thought one knew about lust, love, attraction, attachments to people, etc. Maybe even one was simply in the midst of the most innocent seeming conversation, and one new little detail about one of the speakers changed how one thinks about existence, broadly speaking. So that then, what once seemed like the most unprecedented of personal and or cultural experiences, as one looks back, was no longer as dramatic as the now latest development. For example, let us take a millennial perspective. The millennial perspective interests me at this time, most of all because the millennial is, at the time of this discussion, emerged from the youngest and most immature period of adulthood, early 20s, let us say, but not quite sunken into yet another interesting decade where one's youth perhaps will not count against one quite as blatantly. I'm thinking, say, early to mid 40s. So I'm thinking someone between, let us say, roughly 27 and maybe 43. Someone who, I would say, had the unique experience of living some piece of adolescence upon the dividing line of a more or less pre-internet age, as well as the launch and, shall we say, almost digital first colonization age of the internet. So, growing up, I think many millennials throughout the 1990s might have thought the internet could be the most dramatic thing ever witnessed. Dylan Starr, whose memoirs I've devoted my studies to, who this exhibit, as you see, is all about, he was of that opinion. He thought that the emergence of the internet, or maybe the Clinton impeachment, since no president had been impeached since Andrew Johnson in 1868, were the most dramatic cultural experiences he'd ever lived through. But still, he pointed out in his memoirs that many millennials were not yet even in middle school or junior high when Clinton was impeached. But then 9/11 happened, and so came the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and a generation of military personnel, especially those in Iraq, experienced a military conflict, maybe somewhat comparable to Vietnam in its sense of being a war which was based on a highly bastardized intelligence, claiming Saddam Hussein was in possession of weapons of mass destruction, which contributed to the wider destabilization of the already unstable Middle East. No thanks, in part, to decades of confused Western and Russian foreign policies playing tug of war with the region. My point being, the millennials between early adolescence and through adulthood experienced the first attack on U.S. soil in over half a century. And one might have thought, perhaps, speaking in terms of the waves of culture, this might have been the biggest thing to happen for a while. But then came the Great Recession. And so if the millennial had opted for a conventional route of getting her or his bachelor's degree right after college, he or she very likely was entering a job market and economy in its worst place since the Great Depression. So, to think of this in an almost more spiritual or karmic energy sort of sense, think of the shockwaves to hit the young millennial psyche. The internet revolution, the first impeachment of a U.S. president in a century, the first attack on U.S. soil in over half a century, the worst economic crisis in over half a century. At least the next shockwave, for many, was viewed as extremely encouraging. Not only was the first African American voted into office of U.S. presidency, but he was perhaps the most intellectually astute since JFK, Woodrow Wilson, and he had an air, at least for Dylan Starr, and I would say so myself as well, he had the air of a Lincoln. As, for example, he, President Obama, cried at a press conference lamenting the unbearable pain of constant mass shootings in the last few decades. Right. Of all these shockwaves I mentioned, I did not even mention what it must have been like in middle school or elementary school when news of the Columbine shooting hit. And Obama had shown a compelling and believable display of sympathy and empathy. And then, and this is perhaps why the Dylan Starr memoirs so intrigued me from a historical perspective at least, there is Donald Trump, which was so dramatic for Dylan Starr that it led to his evolution, his transformation from a registered Republican, which he had then been for about half a decade, to a passionate and contrite Democrat. Donald Trump's mere candidacy for the 2016 presidential election sent shockwaves across the planet. When he was elected, even he himself, President Trump, was shocked. And then the unprecedented disaster of his presidency, which was like a mental hurricane or a global flood of the mind. Such a Pandora's box to speak of the sorts of shockwaves. To put it one way, more sociological and rotely historical, that is to say, to step aside from specifics and particulars briefly and consider a trend. Dylan said he could only think to relate to the emergence of the radical Republicans in the time of Lincoln and the Southern strategy of Nixon a century later. I mean, where political parties undergo their own makeovers. The Republican Party as it used to be known, when in fact Dylan had been a registered Republican. To the dismay of one of his friends, a political philosopher and political scientist, Walter Holliday, who had been cultivating his own personal theory and vision of social democracy. More about that later. But back to what I was saying, it was the theory. And I say theory because there was always what the GOP claimed to be, and what it claimed to be as a collective, and what the mainstream GOP would actually vote on. They were called rhinos, Republicans in name only, versus how the more libertarian or conservative factions of the party would vote. It was the theory that the GOP ultimately believed in fiscal responsibility. Ha 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 ha. Please stop. I just can't laugh any harder or I'll vomit and my nose will gush with the coffee I was just drinking. And keeping the president aligned with the strict or originalist interpretations of the U.S. Constitution. But all of this was blown to smithereens when Trump rewrote the GOP platform, so to speak. Maybe one might say this is not too different from the Reagan or Bush Jr. presidencies, but at least in Reagan's case, he stood up to Russia when he negotiated with Russia. And at least Bush Jr. did not become Vladimir Putin's foreign jester when spending. Also, neither Bush nor Reagan were utterly compassionless, even if it took ferocious Democrats in Congress to legally and politically force them into some aspects of compassion, politically speaking. Reagan increased Medicare spending, Bush increased education spending, for example. And when 9/11 happened, Bush did not seek to utterly divide the country by putting all his eggs in an uneducated, cultish, and racist plurality to pull a victory with the Electoral College, or not so blatantly as Trump did. But Trump bit his thumb at NATO, including our most strategic ally against Russia, Ukraine, and acquiesced essentially to Putin's exceptionally good looks when his shirt is off. Oh, come on. Tell me even straight men don't masturbate to pictures of Putin, just like they do to pictures of Mick Jagger. All right, obviously I'm kidding. I've got a wacky sense of humor. Where am I going with this, do you wonder? In the context of all these major dramatic cultural shockwaves comes, I believe, and Dylan Starr was of this point of view as well, the most dramatic and traumatic and unprecedented, the coronavirus 19 pandemic. Unlike anything the world had seen since the Spanish flu a century and 2 years ago. It was deadlier and less contained, the Spanish flu I mean, but I believe we must reiterate with emphasis that nothing quite like this had happened for many generations. And not just the deaths, but an almost complete shutdown of many countries' economies, leading to the highest levels of unemployment since the Great Depression. So what I'm trying to convey is that culturally and globally, people were collectively enduring through a traumatic episode unlike anything many of them had ever seen. This is not to downplay, mind you, the bombings in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the Holocaust, World War I, World War II, the genocides perpetrated against blacks and indigenous populations, or again, the Great Depression, the Spanish flu, the U.S. Civil War, etc. But for those who did not experience those events, like the millennials, they were experiencing their own collective cultural trauma and the question of its impact on the soul, which is one of the fascinating elements of the Dylan Starr Memoirs, does lead me to wonder about the psyches of those who endured traumas like the Holocaust, the bombings in Japan, slavery, widespread cultural trauma, I mean. For some of us, I think perhaps worldviews, philosophies, and ideologies may profoundly change under such circumstances. It makes me think of existentialists and postmodernists in light especially of the post-Depression World War II era. But this comparison remains foggy. But now, to some very specific evolutions in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic that I'm speaking of. To be continued. That's the end of the chapter. That's the end of the segment. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. And, or if you don't view yourself in that binary context, thank you to you as well. Have a great day. Bye.